The cage wasn't meant for a human, but for something wild, something they thought needed taming. It sat under the sweltering Texas sun behind the saloon. Its iron bars rusted from sweat and spilled beer. Inside, a young woman curled her swollen body around her belly, breathing through pain that came in waves like thunder. Her name wasn't written anywhere. To them, she was only a number, scratched into a wooden board nailed above the cage door. Number 27. Men gathered around her like gamblers at a cruel circus. Their boots kicked dust as they laughed, betting who'd die first, the woman or the child. Some called her it, others called her half-blood, their voices carrying the poison of whiskey and hate. The sheriff stood nearby, his badge glinting gold but his heart dark as coal. He didn't stop them. He just watched. The woman's hair clung to her face, dark and matted. She had been sold once, bought twice, and locked up more times than she could count. She tried to run once, toward the river, they said, but the dogs caught her. Since then, they'd stopped calling her by name altogether. Whatever name her mother whispered into her hair when she was a baby was long buried under dust, cruelty, and shame. Elias's eyes moved to the cage. The woman's face was pale, streaked with tears and dust. Her hands clutched the bars, trembling. Another scream tore through her throat, and every man laughed harder. A hand went to a holster. Elias didn't flinch. His eyes stayed fixed on the woman, who now lay in her own blood and dirt, whispering something over and over, something soft, like a prayer or a name. Then, "No, name," he said quietly, brushing dirt from her forehead. "Tell me your name." By midnight, a baby's cry broke through the storm. Sharp, small, alive. The woman wept, holding the child close, her lips trembling as she kissed its tiny forehead. Elias smiled faintly, relief softening the lines in his face. "Where are we going?" she whispered. "What'll you call her?" he asked softly. For the first time in years, the woman smiled. It was faint, fragile, but real. She drifted into sleep, the baby nestled against her chest. Elias sat nearby, his eyes never leaving the door. He knew they wouldn't be safe for long. Men like those back at the saloon didn't forgive. By sunrise, he had a plan. There was a preacher up north who owed him a favor. A man who hid people, gave them new names, new lives. They'd go there. He'd see her safe. Days passed. Hope grew stronger, the woman too. She told Elias bits of her story. How she'd been taken from her mother's farm after her father died. Sold for labor, then for entertainment. How she'd tried to escape but was branded instead. She showed him the scar on her shoulder. Elias didn't speak for a long time after that. One night, as they camped by the river, she asked, "Why did you help me?" Elias looked into the fire. "Because I once watched someone die in a cage," he said. "And I did nothing." Silence. "I didn't even know her name," he added. "She was just another number. But I swore if I ever had a chance to make it right, I would." She touched his hand gently. "You did." By the time they reached the preacher's homestead, the baby was laughing, the woman walking stronger. The preacher, an old man with kind eyes, took them in without question. Papers were signed, new names written. She became Clara Boone. Not a number, not a slave, a woman free. Elias stayed on the porch that night, staring at the stars. He'd never had a family, never thought he would. But when Clara stepped outside, holding hope in her arms, and smiled at him with that quiet warmth, something in him shifted. The night passed too quickly. Elias didn't sleep. Every whisper of wind made his hand twitch toward the revolver resting beside him. Clara and Hope slept inside the cabin, the baby's soft breathing mixing with the creak of wood and the distant howl of coyotes. At sunrise, Elias saddled his horse, eyes scanning the horizon. He knew the men from that town wouldn't let this go. They'd come with torches, guns, and hate, the kind that never dies easy. Clara woke and stepped out onto the porch, her hair catching the first light of morning. "You're leaving," she said quietly. Elias didn't lie. "I have to see how close they are." She walked closer, her hand resting on the doorframe. And if they find you? He met her gaze. Then they find me. Not you. She looked at him for a long time, then nodded. Be careful, Elias. He rode out through the open plains, following the tracks that led south. By noon he saw smoke, small, rising from the distance. A campfire. He slowed his horse and crouched near a ridge. Below, 3 men sat around the fire, laughing. He recognized 2 of them from the saloon. The third he didn't. They had rifles and whiskey. They were talking about a bounty, his name attached to a reward. One of them spat. Sheriff's dead. Town's half scared. But someone's gotta teach Boone a lesson. Elias turned his horse silently and rode back. He knew now what he needed to do. That night, he returned to the preacher's cabin. Clara was rocking Hope near the fire. When she saw him, she smiled with relief, but that smile faded when she saw his face. They're coming? She asked. He nodded. 3 for now. More after. We can run again, she said quickly. Head west, cross the river. He shook his head. We run, they follow. It ends only one way. I won't let them take you again. Her eyes filled with fear and something else, trust. Then I'll stay with you. Elias wanted to tell her no, but he saw the fire in her eyes, the strength she'd found after everything she'd survived. So he nodded once. All right. They fortified the place, nailing shut the back door, stacking barrels near the windows. The preacher, old but strong, brought out a shotgun from under the floorboards. Ain't the first time I've had to stand against devils, he muttered. The night came cold and heavy. Elias sat by the window watching the darkness. Clara fed Hope, humming softly under her breath. It was a song her mother used to sing, though she barely remembered the words. Around midnight the horses came. 3 shadows, then more behind them. The clink of spurs, the whisper of guns being cocked. Elias took a deep breath. Stay low, he whispered to Clara. Then the first bullet shattered the window. The preacher fired back. The cabin filled with smoke and shouting. Elias aimed and fired, his bullets finding their marks with deadly precision. 1 man fell by the fence. Another stumbled, cursing. Then silence. Clara held her breath, clutching Hope close. The baby whimpered softly, but Elias turned and whispered, It's all right, sweetheart. It's all right. He reloaded, hands steady despite the pounding in his chest. Then a voice came from outside. Boone, you can't fight the whole town. Hand her over and we'll let you live. Elias's jaw tightened. You'll have to take her from my grave. Laughter echoed, cruel and hollow. That can be arranged. Another shot rang out. Elias ducked. A bullet grazed his arm. A hand went to a holster. Elias didn't flinch. His eyes stayed fixed on the woman, who now lay in her own blood and dirt, whispering something over and over, something soft, like a prayer or a name. Then, no, name, he said quietly, brushing dirt from her forehead. Tell me your name. By midnight, a baby's cry broke through the storm. Sharp, small, alive. The woman wept, holding the child close, her lips trembling as she kissed its tiny forehead. Elias smiled faintly, relief softening the lines in his face. Where are we going? She whispered. What'll you call her? He asked softly. For the first time in years, the woman smiled. It was faint, fragile, but real. She drifted into sleep, the baby nestled against her chest. Elias sat nearby, his eyes never leaving the door. He knew they wouldn't be safe for long. Men like those back at the saloon didn't forgive. By sunrise, he had a plan. There was a preacher up north who owed him a favor. A man who hid people, gave them new names, new lives. They'd go there. He'd see her safe. Days passed. Hope grew stronger, the woman too. She told Elias bits of her story. How she'd been taken from her mother's farm after her father died. Sold for labor, then for entertainment. How she'd tried to escape but was branded instead. She showed him the scar on her shoulder. Elias didn't speak for a long time after that. One night, as they camped by the river, she asked, Why did you help me? Elias looked into the fire. Because I once watched someone die in a cage, he said. And I did nothing. Silence. I didn't even know her name, he added. She was just another number. But I swore if I ever had a chance to make it right, I would. She touched his hand gently. You did. By the time they reached the preacher's homestead, the baby was laughing, the woman walking stronger. The preacher, an old man with kind eyes, took them in without question. Papers were signed, new names written. She became Clara Boone. Not a number. Not a slave. A woman free. Elias stayed on the porch that night, staring at the stars. He'd never had a family, never thought he would. But when Clara stepped outside, holding hope in her arms, and smiled at him with that quiet warmth, something in him shifted. The night passed too quickly. Elias didn't sleep. Every whisper of wind made his hand twitch toward the revolver resting beside him. Clara and Hope slept inside the cabin, the baby's soft breathing mixing with the creak of wood and the distant howl of coyotes. At sunrise, Elias saddled his horse, eyes scanning the horizon. He knew the men from that town wouldn't let this go. They'd come with torches, guns, and hate, the kind that never dies easy. Clara woke and stepped out onto the porch, her hair catching the first light of morning. You're leaving, she said quietly. Elias didn't lie. I have to see how close they are. She walked closer, her hand resting on the doorframe. And if they find you? He met her gaze. Then they find me, not you. She looked at him for a long time, then nodded. Be careful, Elias. He rode out through the open plains, following the tracks that led south. By noon he saw smoke, small, rising from the distance. A campfire. He slowed his horse and crouched near a ridge. Below, 3 men sat around the fire, laughing. He recognized 2 of them from the saloon. The third he didn't. They had rifles and whiskey. They were talking about a bounty, his name attached to a reward. One of them spat. Sheriff's dead. Town's half scared. But someone's gotta teach Boone a lesson. Elias turned his horse silently and rode back. He knew now what he needed to do. That night, he returned to the preacher's cabin. Clara was rocking Hope near the fire. When she saw him, she smiled with relief, but that smile faded when she saw his face. They're coming? She asked. He nodded. 3 for now. More after. We can run again, she said quickly. Head west, cross the river. He shook his head. We run, they follow. It ends only one way. I won't let them take you again. Her eyes filled with fear and something else, trust. Then I'll stay with you. Elias wanted to tell her no, but he saw the fire in her eyes, the strength she'd found after everything she'd survived. So he nodded once. All right. They fortified the place, nailing shut the back door, stacking barrels near the windows. The preacher, old but strong, brought out a shotgun from under the floorboards. Ain't the first time I've had to stand against devils, he muttered. The night came cold and heavy. Elias sat by the window watching the darkness. Clara fed Hope, humming softly under her breath. It was a song her mother used to sing, though she barely remembered the words. Around midnight the horses came. 3 shadows, then more behind them. The clink of spurs, the whisper of guns being cocked. Elias took a deep breath. Stay low, he whispered to Clara. Then the first bullet shattered the window. The preacher fired back. The cabin filled with smoke and shouting. Elias aimed and fired, his bullets finding their marks with deadly precision. 1 man fell by the fence. Another stumbled, cursing. Then silence. Clara held her breath, clutching Hope close. The baby whimpered softly, but Elias turned and whispered, It's all right, sweetheart. It's all right. He reloaded, hands steady despite the pounding in his chest. Then a voice came from outside. Boone, you can't fight the whole town. Hand her over and we'll let you live. Elias's jaw tightened. You'll have to take her from my grave. Laughter echoed, cruel and hollow. That can be arranged. Another shot rang out. Elias ducked. A bullet grazed his arm. Blood trickled down, but he didn't flinch. The preacher grabbed his shoulder. They'll burn the place down next. Elias nodded. Then we take it to them. He slipped out the back, circling through the trees, his boots silent in the wet grass. He caught one man reloading near the barn and took him down with a single strike. The man fell into the mud, gasping. Elias knelt beside him. "Tell them to stop." The man spat blood. "You think one woman's worth dying for?" Elias's eyes went cold. "She's worth living for." He stood and fired one last shot. When he returned to the cabin, the air was thick with smoke. Flames licked the porch. Clara was by the door, clutching Hope, her face streaked with soot. "We have to go," she cried. Elias grabbed a blanket, wrapped it around them, and kicked open the back wall. They ran into the field as the cabin went up in flames. Behind them, angry shouts grew louder. Bullets tore through the grass. Elias turned, firing back, each shot buying them seconds. The preacher stayed behind, shouting for them to run. The last thing Clara saw was his silhouette in the firelight, standing tall with his shotgun until the night swallowed him whole. They reached the river just before dawn. The water was freezing, rushing fast, but Elias didn't hesitate. He lifted Clara and Hope onto the horse and slapped its side. "Go!" She grabbed his arm. "What about you? I'll be right behind." He pushed her forward, then turned as the men broke through the trees. Their rifles flashed. Elias dove into the river, the cold cutting through his veins like glass. He swam toward the opposite bank, dragging himself up through the reeds. From across the river, Clara screamed his name. He turned, bleeding and breathless, and met her eyes one last time before the fog swallowed him. For hours she waited, clutching Hope against her chest. But Elias didn't come out of that river. Days passed before she made it north. The preacher's friends took her in, gave her shelter, food, and safety. She told them what happened, that Elias had saved them, that he'd given her a name, a life, a reason to fight. They told her he might still be alive, that men like him didn't die easy. She wanted to believe them. Every morning, she stood by the riverbank, hoping. Every night, she told Hope stories about the man who'd given them their second chance. Years later, when Hope could walk, Clara built a small home by the edge of the woods. She taught her daughter to read, to ride, and to never bow her head to anyone who thought her worth less than another. People in nearby towns spoke of a woman who once lived in a cage but now owned her own land. They said she wore a silver ring on her finger, though she never said whose it was. One evening, long after the sun dipped behind the hills, Clara heard a horse outside. She stepped onto the porch, heart pounding. A man sat there, older, scarred, with a limp in his step, but his eyes were the same. Elias. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he smiled faintly. "Told you I'd be right behind." She covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks as she ran into his arms. Hope woke inside, hearing laughter for the first time that sounded like home. And in that quiet place, under the endless western sky, the woman who'd been a number became a name forever remembered. Not because she was saved, but because she refused to die without one. Years later, when people told the story, they said the man who broke the cage didn't just free her, he freed himself. And every time the wind passed through those hills, it carried the echo of her voice, whispering to the world that dignity, once reclaimed, could never be caged again. The days after Elias returned felt like borrowed time. The land was quiet, too quiet, the kind that comes before change. Clara could feel it in her bones, like the earth itself was holding its breath. She had learned long ago that peace in the West never came without a price. Elias worked the fields during the day, teaching Hope to ride, showing her how to track animals, how to listen to the wind for what it doesn't say. Sometimes Clara watched them from the porch, her hands resting on the railing, her heart caught between gratitude and fear. She had seen too much to believe happiness lasted forever. One evening, as the sun burned red over the horizon, Elias sat sharpening his knife, his gaze distant. "They'll come again," he said quietly. Clara didn't ask who. She already knew. "Then we'll be ready," she said, her voice steady. Elias looked at her and smiled faintly, a tired smile that hid too many scars. "You've grown stronger than anyone I've ever known." You made me remember who I was, she said. That strength was always there. That night, Hope wouldn't sleep. She kept asking questions about the stars, about why the world was so big and some people were so cruel. Clara told her that not everyone's heart had learned how to love yet. Hope nodded, but her young eyes seemed older than they should have been. The next morning, a wagon appeared on the distant road. Elias saw it first. He reached for his gun, but Clara stopped him. "Wait," she whispered. The wagon drew closer, creaking and slow. An old woman sat on the seat, reins in her hands, a bonnet shading her face. Behind her were crates of goods and a faded sign that read Hawthorne Trading Company. When the wagon halted, the woman looked up, her eyes sharp and knowing. "You must be the Boones," she said. "I've heard whispers about you." Clara stepped forward cautiously. "Who are you?" "Name's Martha Hawthorne. I trade supplies from town to town. But more important than that, I listen." Elias studied her. "And what have you heard?" Martha's gaze softened. "That you're the man who defied the law to save a woman's life. And that the law hasn't forgiven you for it." Clara's grip tightened around Hope's shoulders. "They're coming again?" "Soon," Martha said. "The new sheriff's worse than the last. Calls himself a man of order, but he's got the same poison in his blood. They say he's hunting for the woman with the brand and the man who took her." Silence hung thick between them. Elias exhaled slowly. "Thank you for warning us." Martha nodded. "I brought supplies. You'll need them if you plan to run. But if you're staying to fight—" She looked at Elias's hand, steady on his holster. "You'll need more than bullets." She stayed for supper that night, telling stories about the frontier, about towns that rose and fell in the dust, about women who vanished and men who tried to save them. Hope listened wide-eyed. Clara found herself clinging to every word that sounded like hope for a better world. When morning came, Martha was gone, leaving behind a sack of dried food, a map, and a note that read, A week later, the riders came again. Not 3 this time, 10, led by a man in a polished coat and a badge that gleamed cruelly in the sun. His name was Sheriff Dalton. He was young, proud, and mean. Elias and Clara saw the dust rising long before they heard the hooves. Clara handed Hope a small wooden horse carved by Elias. "Go inside, sweetheart," she whispered. "And no matter what happens, stay down." Hope nodded, clutching the toy tight, her little body trembling. Elias stepped out onto the porch, rifle slung across his shoulder. The sheriff rode up, dismounted, and smiled. A cold, practiced smile. "Elias Boone," he said, "you're a hard man to find. Not hard enough, it seems." "You've got something that don't belong to you," Dalton said, glancing at Clara. "That woman was property once. She ran. You helped her. That makes you both fugitives." Elias's voice was calm. "No one owns another soul." The sheriff's smile vanished. "Law says otherwise." "Then the law's wrong." Dalton's men began to spread out, circling the house. Clara stepped beside Elias, her chin lifted. "You'll have to go through me first." Dalton sneered. "That can be arranged." Before the first shot was fired, the sound of a rifle cracked through the air, not from the porch but from the hill beyond. One of Dalton's men fell from his horse. Then another. The sheriff spun around, shouting orders. Elias didn't waste the chance. He fired twice, clean and fast. Clara grabbed Hope and ran inside as bullets splintered the walls. Outside, the ground shook with the chaos of hooves and gunfire. When the smoke cleared, 5 men lay still. The others retreated toward the trees. The sheriff was gone. Elias dropped to one knee, breathing hard, blood seeping through a tear in his sleeve. "He'll be back," Clara said, her voice shaking. "Not until he regroups," Elias replied. "Whoever fired those shots saved us." They followed the trail up the hill and found Martha, rifle in hand, her bonnet gone, hair wild in the wind. "Didn't think I'd leave you to the wolves," she said, grinning. Elias stared at her, half in shock. "You could have been killed." "Wouldn't be the first time men tried," she said. "But I'm tired of watching good people die while cowards make laws." For the next few days, they fortified the land again. Martha stayed, teaching Clara how to shoot better, how to load fast and aim true. Hope learned to stay quiet, to listen for danger. But one evening, as they sat around the fire, Clara noticed something in Elias's eyes. A faraway look, the kind that meant he was planning something. "You're leaving again," she said quietly. He didn't deny it. "If I don't go to them, they'll come to us. They'll burn everything down. You can't face them alone. I've done it before. And you barely came back." Elias reached for her hand, his rough fingers tracing the scar on her shoulder. "I won't let them take this from you," he whispered. "Not after everything." She wanted to fight him, but she knew that look. He'd made up his mind. Before dawn, he saddled his horse. Clara stood in the doorway, Hope asleep in her arms. "Come back to us," she said. "I will." She didn't believe him, but she hoped anyway. Elias rode into the mist, the land stretching wide and merciless around him. He rode to end something, to make sure Clara and Hope would never have to run again. In town, the sheriff waited, an ambush already set. Elias walked straight into it, unarmed except for the Colt at his hip and the courage of a man with nothing left to lose. Dalton stood on the steps of the courthouse, his badge glinting. "You came to die?" he called. Elias shook his head. "I came to live free." And when the gunfire started, the town would never forget how one man stood against them all. How a single moment of courage burned brighter than all their cruelty. It was the kind of stand that changed people not through words but through the echo it left behind. And far away, Clara woke suddenly, her heart pounding, as if the wind had carried his final breath to her door. The town of Red Creek never slept easy after that night. The gunfire had echoed off every wall, bouncing through empty alleys, carrying the sound of something ending. When morning came, smoke still hung in the air, and people whispered about the man who'd walked into town alone. Some said he was dead. Others said he vanished before the dawn. But in the dust outside the courthouse, the sheriff's badge lay face down, half-buried, stained dark with blood that wasn't his. No one knew what truly happened. They only knew the lawman who rode with Dalton never came back. Miles away, Clara felt the earth shift beneath her feet. She had been drawing water from the well when the bucket slipped from her hands and hit the dirt. Hope came running, frightened by the sound. "Mama, what's wrong?" Clara knelt, clutching her chest as if something deep inside had been torn loose. "Nothing, sweetheart," she whispered, though the lie burned her throat. "Go back inside." That night she sat by the window, staring at the moon and waiting for the sound of hooves. The baby she'd once held in a cage was now old enough to ask about the father who taught her to ride. "When's he coming home?" Hope asked, sleepy-eyed, her small hand clutching the wooden horse. "Soon," Clara said softly. He promised. But weeks turned to months, and the promise grew quiet. Still, Clara didn't stop waiting. Each morning she left a lantern burning on the porch, and each night she prayed to the stars she didn't believe in. Martha stayed by her side. "You can't live on hope alone," she said one evening. "I have to," Clara replied. "It's all I have." The seasons changed. Grass turned to gold, rivers ran low, and the child who once cried in the dark learned to laugh again. Hope grew into a girl with her father's eyes and her mother's spirit sharp, steady, unyielding. By the time she was 12, she could shoot straighter than most men in town. Martha often said, "That one was born free and means to stay that way." Then one autumn morning a letter arrived. The handwriting was rough, ink smudged, paper worn by travel. Clara's hands trembled as she broke the seal. It was from a doctor in a border town miles away. The words were simple but heavy. A man named Elias Boone was found half alive on the trail. He spoke your name before he went silent. If you wish to see him, come soon. Clara didn't wait for sunrise. She packed a satchel, saddled the horse, and kissed Hope's forehead. "I'll bring him home," she promised. "I want to come too," Hope pleaded. "Not this time, darling. Stay with Martha. Be brave." The road to the border was long and cruel. Clara rode through wind and rain, through memories that tried to pull her back. Every mile hurt, But she didn't stop. She couldn't. When she reached the small doctor's shack by the river, she saw him thin, broken, a shadow of the man she remembered. His beard had grown white, his hands scarred and trembling, but when he opened his eyes, they were still the same, gray and kind, full of fight. "You came," he whispered, voice barely a breath. She fell to her knees beside him, tears spilling freely. "You didn't think I'd let you do this alone, did you?" He smiled faintly. "Didn't think I'd still be here to see it. You always keep your word." He tried to laugh, but it turned into a cough. She held him close until his breathing steadied. Over the next days, she nursed him like he once protected her. He told her what happened, that Dalton had fallen, that some townsfolk helped him escape after realizing who the real monsters were. He'd wandered for weeks, half dead, guided only by her name and a promise he refused to break. "You changed them, Clara," he said one night. "You made them see what dignity looks like." "I didn't," she said softly. "You did. You showed me I was more than what they called me." He took her hand, his thumb tracing the edge of her scar. "That scar," he said, "used to mean pain. Now it means you lived." She kissed his forehead. "And so did you." When he was strong enough to ride, they made their way home. The journey was slow, but with each sunrise, his strength returned, and her heart lightened. When they reached the valley, Hope came running through the grass, shouting and crying all at once. Elias dismounted with shaking legs, kneeling as she threw her arms around him. "Told you I'd come back," he whispered. She pulled away, eyes shining. "Mama said you always keep your promises." He looked at Clara, smiling through tears. "She taught me how." The three of them stood there in the wind, surrounded by the quiet song of the land that had seen too much suffering and still dared to bloom. Life didn't turn easy after that. The West was still hard, and people still cruel, but their home became a place others came to when they needed help. Travelers, runaways, broken souls, all found food, shelter, and kindness there. Hope grew into a young woman, fierce and fair, defending those who couldn't defend themselves. Folks started calling the place Boone's Rest, a safe stop for anyone searching for freedom. Sometimes at dusk, Elias would sit by the fire, holding Clara's hand, and whisper, "Do you ever think about the cage?" She would nod. "Every day." "Do you ever hate them for it?" "No," she said, "because if they hadn't locked me away, I never would have met the man who broke the bars." He smiled, eyes soft. "And gave you a name, and gave me a life." When Elias passed years later, the townsfolk buried him on the hill overlooking the fields he'd tamed. Clara placed a wooden marker at his grave. Not fancy, just a single word carved deep into the grain. Freedom. She sat beside it every evening, telling stories of their journey, of the cage, the river, and the baby who cried her first breath in a storm. Hope, now grown, listened and remembered. When Clara grew old, the townspeople still came to her porch to hear the tale of the woman who had been a number but became a name. Some cried, some stayed silent, all left changed. And when the final day came, Clara's last words were a whisper carried by the wind. "No one owns the sky." Hope took the land after her mother passed, keeping Boone's Rest alive. She built a school where the cabin once stood and taught children what her parents had taught her. That dignity is not something given by others, it's something you carry within. Every spring, she laid fresh wildflowers on both graves, watching the petals scatter in the wind. Some said on quiet nights, when the moon rose over the plains, you could still hear two voices, soft, steady, and strong, telling each other the same promise they once made long ago, that love, once freed, could never be caged again. Years rolled on like the slow bend of the river that wound past Boone's Rest. The small settlement grew, not by wealth or gold, but by stories. People came because they heard whispers carried down from travelers, about a woman who once gave birth in chains, about a man who tore those chains apart, and about a little girl who grew up to carry their legacy in her hands. Hope Boone became the beating heart of Red Creek Valley. She was her father's courage and her mother's soul, wrapped in the same quiet strength that once defied cruelty itself. By 20, She had rebuilt the old barn into a shelter for women who had nowhere to go. "This place isn't charity," she told them gently. "It's home until you can stand again." Her voice carried the same conviction her parents lived by, firm, kind, and unshakable. The townspeople began to see her not as the child of rumor, but as the woman of honor. Some came to ask for work, others for guidance. Hope gave both freely, because she remembered what her mother had told her. What's taken by force can be returned by love, but even peace draws envy. One summer, a group of men rode into town from the south, drifters, slick-tongued and cruel in the way that only those who never built anything could be. They mocked Boone's Rest, sneering at the women who found refuge there. "Ain't no law out here but what a man says," their leader jeered. Hope stood before them, her father's rifle resting easy in her arms. "Then you're in the wrong place," she said calmly. "Here we answer to what's right." The men laughed until they saw she didn't flinch. Her stare was steady, and the whole town stood behind her, farmers and widows alike, each one ready to defend the ground Elias and Clara had turned into sanctuary. The drifters backed down that day, not because they were outnumbered, but because something in her eyes reminded them of the kind of courage that doesn't come from hate, only from love that refuses to die. That night, as the sun fell behind the hills, Hope sat on the porch where her parents once watched the stars. Martha was long gone, but Hope still spoke aloud as if she were near. "They tried again today," she whispered, "but they didn't win." The wind carried her words softly across the plains, and she smiled faintly. She could almost hear her mother's voice, calm and proud. "You've done well, my girl." The years turned kind to the land. The river that had once run dry flowed again, feeding crops and cattle. Children laughed where once there had been sorrow. The people of Red Creek learned that justice wasn't something you waited for. It was something you built with your own hands. And at the heart of it all was Boone's Rest, still standing, its door always open. And when the wind blew just right, she could swear she heard laughter carried across the grass. The same laughter that once filled a small cabin, when Hope was a baby cradled by a man and woman who refused to let the world take her name. When Hope's time finally came, it wasn't with fear or sorrow. She sat beneath the wide western sky, hands folded, eyes lifted toward the stars. The townspeople found her there at dawn, peaceful, the faintest smile on her face. Beside her was a single note, written in a steady hand. "Freedom lives where love dares to fight for it." They buried her on the same hill, between her parents, beneath a marker that read simply, "Hope Boone, born free, died free." Years later, travelers passing through Red Creek would stop to rest at the little homestead still called Boone's Rest. They'd sit by the fire as old men told the story. How once, a woman gave birth in a cage while men placed bets, and how a stranger broke those chains and gave her not just a name, but a life. And as the flames danced and the night grew quiet, the younger ones always asked the same question. Was it real? The storyteller would smile, eyes gleaming in the firelight. It was as real as the stars above you, because freedom, child, freedom begins the moment someone refuses to look away. And the wind would whisper through the grass again, soft, eternal, carrying the sound of a promise that outlived every storm. That no cage, no cruelty, no darkness could ever outlast the light of a love that remembered your name. Decades passed, and Boone's Rest became more than a small town. It became a symbol. People from far-off counties, and even the edges of the frontier, came to see the place where a woman's dignity was restored, and a man's courage rebuilt what cruelty had tried to erase. The story of Clara and Elias Boone was told in schoolhouses, whispered in church gatherings, and printed in old newspapers that yellowed with time. But more than words, it lived in the way people treated each other. There were no cages anymore. There were no bets. There were only hands, rough, working hands, reaching to lift others instead of pushing them down. Hope Boone's legacy had spread wider than the valley her parents once called home. It became part of the land itself, part of the American breath that said, no matter how far we fall, we rise together. One stormy night, years after Hope's passing, a stranger rode into Boone's Rest. He was young, no more than 30, with a scar down his cheek and eyes that carried the kind of weariness no sleep could cure. His horse stumbled from exhaustion, its hooves slick with mud. He tied it by the old fence and looked up at the house, the same one built by Elias and Clara, its porch now covered in ivy and thyme. But the light inside still burned. The door creaked open, and an elderly woman stepped out, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. "Can I help you, son?" she asked. He hesitated, voice rough as gravel. "Ma'am. Someone told me this place takes in the broken." She studied him for a moment and smiled faintly. "Then you're home." His name was Samuel Reed. He'd been a soldier, one of many who had seen too much and returned to find the world had moved on without him. He carried guilt the way others carried scars, visible only when he thought no one was watching. The woman who'd taken over Boone's Rest, a gentle widow named Alma, gave him work fixing the fences and tending the horses. He spoke little, but each morning he looked out at the horizon and felt something unfamiliar. Peace, maybe, or the start of it. One evening, while cleaning out the barn, he found an old wooden chest beneath the hayloft. Inside were letters, bound in ribbon and worn with age. The handwriting was soft, delicate. "My dearest Hope." That night, when Samuel passed, the girl stayed. She took care of Boone's Rest the way generations before her had done. She built a school on the far side of the pasture, calling it the Boone Academy of Dignity and Courage. In the quiet years that followed, Boone's Rest became less a town and more a living memory, a sanctuary where time didn't forget what it meant to be human. The wind still sang through the wheat fields, the river still glittered beneath the dawn, and every soul who came through the worn gate felt something that couldn't be explained, only felt deep in the bones. Some said it was the spirit of Clara Boone that lingered there, the woman who once gave birth behind bars and turned her pain into the seed of a movement. Others believed it was Elias, still keeping watch, making sure no one ever laid chains upon another again. But those who lived there knew the truth, it was both of them. Love had made this land sacred. The school had grown over the years. What began as a single room with wooden benches and a chalkboard became a sprawling academy surrounded by orchards and laughter. The walls were lined with carved words from Elias's old journal. Phrases like, "No one's worth is measured in gold," and "The strongest thing a man can do is be kind." Teachers came from far and wide to work there, drawn not by salary or reputation but by the sense that they were part of something holy, something pure. The young girl who'd once arrived lost and quiet, her name was Lila, had become the new matron of Boone's Rest. She was tall and steady-voiced, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes full of calm. She taught not just lessons but meaning. She'd tell her students, "History isn't words in a book. It's the choices we make when no one's watching." One spring morning, a government man arrived from the city. He wore a fine coat, polished boots, and the kind of expression that looked down before it looked around. "Miss Lila Boone?" he asked, stepping off his horse. She nodded politely. "This land, this Boone's Rest, it's sitting on property the county might need. We're building a new rail line through these parts." The students working in the fields stopped and stared. Lila's face didn't change. She simply said, "This land isn't for sale, sir." The man smirked. "Everything's for sale, ma'am. It's just numbers." Yes. Weeks passed, and letters began arriving from across the state. People who'd heard about Boone's Rest and refused to let it be erased. Former students, settlers, and townsfolk signed petitions, sent supplies, and offered to fight with their words if not their hands. The government eventually backed down. The rail line bent around Boone's Rest like a river curving around a rock that would not move. The papers called it a triumph of heritage. But those who lived there knew better. It wasn't about heritage, it was about heart. Years later, when Lila grew old, she wrote her own letter to the future. She sealed it in a tin box and buried it beneath the oak tree behind the school. It read, "To whoever finds this, remember what this land taught us. There will always be men who count their worth in numbers. But if you must count, count kindness. Count courage. Count the names of those who stood for something when silence would have been easier." After her passing, the academy carried her name for a time, but even that eventually faded. Names change, buildings fall, but the soil kept its memory. The wind still whispered stories. Travelers still came to rest by the hill, lighting small candles and telling their children. Once, a woman gave birth in a cage while men placed bets. But a man broke those chains, gave her a name, and they built a world that refused to forget her. And though the world beyond Boone's Rest grew louder, machines, cities, wars, the little patch of land remained quiet, sacred, untamed. Generations later, when no one could trace the Boones by blood anymore, the spirit of their kindness still lived in those who stayed, in those who listened to the earth and remembered what it meant to see another soul as equal. Many more seasons came and went across the plains, until Boone's Rest stood as the oldest living story left in the valley. The town itself had quieted. The trains roared far away now, and the world had moved into machines and cities and glowing lights that never dimmed. Yet, when people from distant places came west to escape the noise, they always found their way to that quiet hill. The house still stood, aged wood, cracked paint, and a porch swing that creaked like an old heartbeat, but the feeling there was unchanged. Even without the Boones, their presence hung in the wind. One autumn evening, a young historian named Rachel Morgan arrived with a notebook and a voice recorder. She'd been tracing forgotten stories of American courage for a new project, a series about dignity and love in the hardest places. She parked her truck by the fence, stepped into the golden light, and whispered to herself, "It's real." She'd read about Boone's Rest, but no book or photograph could capture the stillness that seemed to speak from the earth itself. Rachel spent days exploring, listening to the silence between the wind and the grass. The townsfolk who still lived nearby were few, but they remembered enough. "My granddad said it started with a woman in a cage," an old man told her at the diner, "and ended with a place that freed everyone who came through its doors." Rachel nodded, tears in her eyes. "I think that's the most American story I've ever heard." That night, she sat by the graves under the oak tree and read aloud from the old letters she had found in the Boone archive. A collection of letters written by Clara to Elias when they were apart during his travels, full of hope and the will to live. Her voice trembled as she read, "They took my name, but you gave it back. You made me real again. That's all I ever wanted." Rachel's documentary was released the next spring. It was called A Name for the Nameless. It spread across the country, through small towns and city schools alike. People wept. Veterans, widows, women, and men who had felt invisible all wrote to her, saying that the story of Boone's Rest had reminded them that they mattered. The line that struck them most was one she'd written while sitting on that hill. "Freedom isn't the sound of a gate opening. It's the voice that dares to call you by your name." Donations began pouring in from across the country. Volunteers rebuilt the academy. Artists painted murals of Clara and Elias holding their daughter beneath a sky of unbroken blue. The town once forgotten became a living museum, but not the kind filled with glass cases. It became a home again, open to women escaping violence, to men searching for purpose, to children who needed to know they were seen. One day, during the red dusk of summer, a little girl wandered to the hill while her mother worked in the garden. She knelt by the 3 graves, tracing the letters carved in the stone. "Mama," she asked later that evening, "were they real?" Her mother smiled, brushing dirt from her hands. "Yes, sweetheart, very real." "Then why don't they come back?" the girl asked softly. Her mother pointed to the open door of the home, where laughter floated like light. "They never left," she said. As night fell, the girl sat on the porch swing, her small legs kicking at the air. The wind began to hum through the fields, the same soft sound it had carried for more than a century. If one listened closely, it was almost like voices layered upon voices, echoing through time. Elias's promise, Clara's courage, Hope's laughter, Samuel's redemption, Lila's wisdom, all blending into something bigger than memory, something eternal. In the distance, the church bell rang, calling the people of Boone's Rest together for evening prayers. Rachel, who had returned to live there, stepped out onto the porch, gazing at the orange glow of the sunset over the hills. They were never just a story, she whispered. They were the beginning of who we could be. When darkness came and the stars unfolded above, the land shimmered faintly with light, soft, silver, and alive. And somewhere in that vast, quiet expanse, the spirit of the woman who once gave birth in a cage looked upon the home she'd inspired. No bets, no bars, just freedom, just names. The wind carried her voice, as gentle as the night itself. Every time someone is seen for who they are, I am still here. And for the first time in 100 years, Boone's Rest seemed to breathe. The lanterns flickered, the fields glowed gold, and from every corner of that sacred ground came the sound of life, laughter, and love. The proof that no cruelty could erase what the Boones had built. Because the story wasn't about cages or chains anymore. It was about the hands that broke them, and the hearts that refused to forget. And somewhere, under the wide American sky, a whisper echoed forever. She gave birth in a cage while men placed bets, until he broke them, gave her a name, not a number. And from that name a world was born free.